Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together.
Welcome back, everybody, and I just have to say we are proud to announce our first partnership with a great company, Aunt Susie's Granola, AuntSusiesGranola.com. If you love granola, then you're going to love Aunt Susie's Granola. Aunt Susie's is a 100% gluten-free kitchen. They've expanded their product offerings to include overnight oats and other kind of snacks. My favorite flavors are salted caramel and s'mores, so try those out. Aunt Susie's Granola is shipped coast to coast online with subscription service options. The owner, Erica, has generously offered our listeners a great deal. From now until July 31st, listeners of our little podcast can use the code GenX Classic Sports, all one word, GenX Classic Sports, for a 20% discount, one per customer. That's GenX Classic Sports, one word, for a 20% discount through July 31st at Aunt Susie's Granola, A-U-N-T, Susie's Granola.
Okay, I believe this will be episode 23, Steve, and we're going to talk one more time about the topic that won't go away. This is Steve Brown with me. He's been on here before, and I believe you divulged, Steve, that you grew up in the thriving metropolis of Augusta when we were on here together first time.
Absolutely.
All right, and so basically what happened was we got to talking about wrestling on the side one day and decided we were going to talk wrestling, and then things didn't work out, and I ended up going with another episode anyway of wrestling, and Steve said, hey, we still need to talk wrestling, and I believe him, so there's still a lot to mine there, so we're going to talk some more wrestling. So Steve, in Augusta, Arkansas, you're a few years older than me, not too many. So how was wrestling for you as a kid, viewing wrestling and learning about it and getting into it?
Yeah, I think it came on, like 11 o'clock on Saturday, 11 o'clock at noon on Saturdays. I think that's what we decided
in earlier podcasts, that it was right after cartoons and probably before Bandstand or something like that.
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
Well, my dad, we grew up poor in Woodruff County, like a lot of folks did, and my dad was not a big sports guy, but he loved wrestling. And awesome. So, he got me hooked at an early age, and he would not miss an episode on Saturday mornings.
I believe it was cartoons for us from about 6:30 to 11, and then it was over to now. Okay, so we've talked before on here about the 3-channel days, and this kind of impacts this because there's only so many channels you were going to get out of Augusta, I'm sure. So if your dad was a big fan, what would the antenna get you back in those days?
We got the Little Rock channels, and okay. if we turned it just right, we could get Jonesboro. We couldn't get Memphis. We tried, but we couldn't get Memphis. And you would think kind of where Augusta is located, kind of right there in that corridor, it's about, you can go to Memphis or Little Rock about the same amount of distance or time, and but we couldn't get the Memphis channel.
That's what I thought you were going to say.
So Channel 4 on Saturday mornings to watch Mid-South.
Okay, so Mid-South. And you and I talked a little bit about the first name you mentioned when we first talked about this was Leroy McGurk.
Yeah.
So let's go back to what I know from researching this for the first couple episodes. So Mid-South really came from what they called the Tri-States Wrestling Alliance or something to that effect. And that was run by a guy named Leroy McGurk. And you just told me a few minutes ago you actually started out watching him be a commentator on the wrestling broadcast.
Yeah, and it tells you how naive I was, or just a little kid, because they would tell you blind Leroy McGurk on the microphone, and as a kid we didn't put together how that blind man's calling that match.
Right, yeah. See, I didn't see any footage of him actually calling matches, so that's really interesting that the kids were like, yeah, blind Leroy's doing his thing over there. I told you, I looked it up, though, and he really did. I think he was already blind in one eye or something, and he had a car wreck that robbed him of seeing in his other eye, so somehow he was running a wrestling company truly blind, and he had been a wrestler, right? I believe that's correct.
Yeah, I think he was a wrestler before.
And if I'm not mistaken, he's actually the mentor, one of the many mentors for Bill Watts. And so I think that's where this story really kind of begins.
Right.
Is that at some point Bill Watts took on more and more responsibility with McGurk's outfit. Does that ring a bell?
That sounds right. And you know, from memory, when watching it, Watts was one of the big stars.
Right.
So you know, you didn't really back then understand the business aspect of it. But you know, him and Danny Hodge and you know a few of the others. When I first started watching and remembering, those were the superstars.
Yeah, I told you my mom was a big Danny Hodge fan, and apparently had seen him wrestle at like fairgrounds and such around the state of Arkansas, growing up in Hot Springs. I actually, since the first 2 episodes of this about wrestling, I've done some more YouTube looking around, and I actually found footage of that league, the Tri-States thing, and I did find some old enough that you could tell clearly Bill Watts was like their marquee guy. He was very active wrestling. Clearly you can see he's a younger man in this, but you can still, and I don't know where they filmed those. I don't know if they were filming. I know that what became the Mid-South wrestling area was already part of that area. I think they may have expanded it with Bill Watts. But very similar approach to how they shot it, filmed it, the crowds. Not the same setting, but very similar approaches to sort of the grittiness. And it's just amazing, thank God for YouTube, because there's so much of this you can still go out there and watch. So, all right, so I grew up watching Mid-South on a ABC affiliate down in Shreveport, Louisiana. So you're telling me you saw it here out of Little Rock.
Out of Little Rock, yeah,
okay,
on the NBC affiliate.
Okay, so, well, those 2 are the only 3 channels available. We had them covered, didn't we?
We did.
And then that means also, do you remember any events around you in Augusta, live events? Like, whether you went or not, don't matter, but do you remember even hearing about it?
I don't remember them coming to that, you know, near where I was at, but you know, they were in Little Rock on a regular basis.
Yeah, they were.
And I do remember as a kid, I had an uncle. I mean, not this matters to anyone, but I had an uncle from Michigan who was a big wrestling fan. He was a brother to my dad, and he had come down at one point and had promised to take me to wrestling if he ever, you know, but. He came down, and he ended up going back pretty quickly for some unknown reason, and we didn't get to go to wrestling, so I was pretty disappointed.
And well, this whole thing kind of happened because the guys that I've talked to already, my brother and Kim, it really started because the 3 of us went together with some family to El Dorado to watch wrestling, and some of our favorite guys were on that. So I've since done enough research to know that Little Rock was a major part of Mid-South wrestling. So the people that don't know the geography of it, my hometown lies between Shreveport and Monroe, Louisiana. If you're leaving either one of those areas and going towards something in Arkansas, you're likely to go through my old hometown down in Junction City. So there was a lot of traffic through there of wrestlers and a lot of wrestling fans. But some of the discussions that, like Jim Cornette, for example, has on his podcast, and I urge all the wrestling fans to go listen to that. He talks a lot about Arkansas highways, and I've mentioned this before maybe, but the Hope Watermelon Festival where they drove all day to wrestle for $60 or something. I mean, heck of a way to make a living, really. Yeah. But I have seen Bill Watts interviewed, and I've heard Jimmy Cornette talk about it. Little Rock was a major stop for the operation to make some money, because I guess Barton Coliseum.
Yeah, regularly at Barton.
On a regular basis. They kept the Highway 167 between Ruston, Louisiana, and Little Rock pretty regular. They stayed on that. All right, so what's interesting about where you grew up, as you've already said, is the relationship between Little Rock and Memphis geographically, because back then, as we've established on here, everything was regional.
Yeah.
So you might have a state covered, or part of a state, or 2 or 3 smaller states, or whatever the deal may be. And so McGurk and then later Bill Watts had Mid-South that may basically encompass Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and only Houston and West Texas apparently in places, because the Von Erichs had Dallas and everything on the north part of Dallas. But to the east of you and to the northeast of me back then was this whole Memphis outfit. And I read up on this last night because I'm really not that familiar with it, but I knew who Jerry Lawler was. Because he was on the cover of all the wrestling magazines that I went to the grocery store and got. If it had Jerry Lawler, if it was in there, it was either Jerry Lawler or Dusty Rhodes on most of them, and then eventually Ric Flair.
And it was really interesting because when I was a kid, Mid-South was it. And then when I went to college, I went to school at Arkansas State in Jonesboro. And so there was a big contingency of us that we would go to Memphis on Monday nights on a pretty regular basis for their house shows. And so got exposure to a lot of that, and kind of got into it as a young adult. But that was a kind of a golden time for their franchise, because there was it wasn't just Lawler. There were a lot of stars that were evolving and coming out of the Memphis area that you later saw on either the Atlanta program, the big program that Ted Turner had, or in the WWF.
Agree, because I pulled this off of the internet, and it's got a list of the guys that wrestled there. I'll leave one of them out for now, but the Sheik, there was the Sheik, Bam Bam Bigelow. I know you remember him.
Yeah. Rock and Roll Express, Midnight Express,
Bob Armstrong and his son Brad Armstrong,
Bill Dundee.
And Buddy Landell, Cactus Jack. There's a long Jesse Ventura wrestled there. Ken Patera. All these names, all the people listening to this know, and you're thinking, wait, didn't you mention a lot of those for Mid-South? I did, because that's how it worked back then. I've even heard and Jim Cornette talking about how each regional boss, so for Mid-South, maybe Ernie Ladd or Bill Watts, would go to another region just to give notes. And apparently the reason Rock and Roll Express ended up in Mid-South is because Jerry Lawler, at the request of Bill Watts, he came to Monroe or Shreveport or somewhere, and he watched what was going on, took notes, and they had a powwow, and he told Bill Watts, you got to get the girls here. You got to get the chicks back in the stands. And he said, well, I don't have that kind of talent right now. We're locked into these stores. He said, well, I do. If you want to pull from me, I'll pull from you. And so they literally, like the NFL, made a trade, and Jim Cornette as manager and the Midnight Express got borrowed along with the Rock and Roll. They actually, I think they formed the Rock and Roll Express to bring them in or something. And they came to Mid-South to pump the youth back in the excitement of the girls with the heartthrob guys and all that. And I can't remember now. It could have, I don't remember. Somebody, Bill Watts, gave up 2 or 3 guys, and that's how they worked that out. And as my buddy Ken pointed out on the earlier episodes, the reason they had to do that was survival. Because there's always the threat of Vince McMahon Sr. up in the Northeast wanting to go coast to coast with his operation. So they fought this dude off for a good decade.
Well, and as you know, back at that point, they made their money off house shows and and all that stuff. So they needed the crowds, they had and if the house show crowds were suffering, they had to change the demographics of that, and that was the perfect way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So who else do you remember out of Memphis?
Well, the big thing,
Lawler.
Lawler was the guy, obviously, and but at that point in time, as most people will remember of a certain age, that was the time when Andy Kaufman had his big deal with Lawler, and I was at a couple.
I was hoping you'd go there.
Actually, was there at a couple of house shows where Andy Kaufman was in Memphis, and I remember one, very vividly where. And it would play out the same way every time. He would pick a woman out of the audience and just get her up there. And this time it was a healthy young lass, and he gets her up there and just berates her and slaps her around and beats on her.
He always wore thermal underwear with a pair of shorts over.
With a pair of shorts over them, and he'd let her come back on him a little bit, just tease and then mock her and all that. And then, at the end, Lawler would come out and, and beat him up pretty good. But
I can't believe you were at live house shows for that.
2 of them.
Wow.
I mean, it was great. And it was really at that point in time where it was really toward the end of where it culminated, where he and Lawler got in a fight on the Letterman show.
On Letterman. Yeah, so I doubt anyone listening to this doesn't know this story, but Andy Kaufman, of course, from TV, Taxi, and from Saturday Night Live skits and stuff, comedian. He started doing that in nightclubs, wrestling women.
Yeah.
And it kind of grew into this weird slice of Americana at the time, where he was actually going around the country as part of his act and wrestling women. And the background was that Lawler didn't like it once it came to Memphis. He was because Lawler was heel for a while, and then he went good. So somewhere in all that, he's going to stand up for these Memphis lasses, as you called them.
Yeah.
And it started this thing, and it just grew. I can so remember the Letterman thing, but it ended up at one event, Lawler put the brain buster on him like twice.
Yeah.
And he goes away in a neck brace.
Yeah, and I think I'm remembering that was one of the 2 that I was at.
And I think I've got that so you're on this history here that I'm looking at.
But Kaufman made a great heel. I mean, he knew he could work the crowd like nobody else. I mean, he had everyone in the arena lathered up and ready to charge the ring and murder him.
Even better is that the brainbuster was a banned move.
Yeah, exactly.
And so he did it not once,
but twice. Yeah.
And Andy Kaufman was one of those dudes that his specialty was getting under your skin, right?
Absolutely.
And so years later, so it culminates, as Steve said, culturally with them having another altercation on Letterman.
Right.
And Lawler slapping the crap out of him, and it kind of just from there. And I don't remember much beyond that, but I do know that years later, the Jim Carrey movie came out, and Lawler was actually in it, playing himself.
Yep.
And since then, of course, as you talked about earlier with the blind color analyst on a wrestling match, we all know now, and we didn't as kids, this was all just staged. It was all a thing, an angle that they worked for years. I guess it was years. I mean,
that period of time, I mean, it may have been a year. It wasn't a long,
but it was intense.
But it was very intense. Yeah.
Well, hey, whatever sells tickets.
Absolutely.
So if you think Jerry Lawler is going to brainbuster Andy Kaufman, and you know what's funny? You said you're going down from Jonesboro to Memphis. What are y'all getting, $3 seats, maybe?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, we'd spend a lot more on beer than we spent on seats.
And see, that's one of the other things that's so fascinating about Cornette. Cornette does a really good job on his podcast of telling you what the dollars equal to show you what you were getting. And even to this day, I mean, money to money, apples to apples wise, he'll tell you, he was like, well, that would be the equivalent of a $20 ticket now, whatever he's talking. And you still think that's pretty good value, man. I mean, that's pretty good deal. So there were tons of shows where you probably could have gotten in for $2 or $3 easily.
But for 7 or 8 guys from Arkansas driving an hour and a half to Memphis to go eat barbecue, drink a couple of beers,
cheap night of
it was
entertainment.
it was a great night out.
I kind of equate that to minor league baseball because I used to, when I moved to Little Rock, that was the cheapest entertainment I could find was the Travelers games. Okay, so here's the other thing. What this enabled them to do, Steve, though, was the thing that I've liked the most about the regional background for wrestling is how there were loose affiliations. So I'm sitting here looking at the note, and Memphis was I think it was the Continental Wrestling Association, technically, is what they settled on. Everybody just called it the Memphis Circuit, though, really. They were underneath the umbrella of the NWA.
Right.
And the NWA was ruled for decades by Ric Flair. And so what that allowed them to do was borrow each other's guys and sell out arenas. And Ken and Casey and I touched on this, but we didn't really talk about it with Memphis so much. So I'll be curious what you say about maybe names that you heard flow through there and rivalries and such. But Ken and I talked about how we really thought we were dreaming when we said, no, I know I saw Dusty Rhodes in Mid-South, and then we did the research, and sure enough we did. Well, the same thing happened with Lawler.
Yeah.
So they could for example, they might make a storyline where Dusty rolls through Ric Flair, but it was all under the umbrella, this says for 10 years, of the NWA. So any borrowing and back and forth and all that would have been orchestrated by Jimmy Hart and Jerry Lawler and whoever was running Georgia. I don't even remember who was that. Jim Crockett? That was Jim Crockett, or I believe.
Was that Jim Crockett?
Yeah, I always. Okay. Sometimes I say Jim Crockett when I mean Jim Cornette and vice versa. Yeah. But it was Jim Crockett, I thought, running Georgia. Was it?
I was thinking he had the Carolinas, but I may be wrong.
But you know what? You may be right. But I'm just glancing at these names, and it brings back so many memories about the Jimmy Hart's first family.
Yeah.
That feud that was going on with whoever Lawler could gather up.
Yeah.
Bobby Eaton.
Yeah. Bobby Eaton, who ended up being part of Midnight Express.
Exactly. And it says in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, Lawler engaged in feuds with Dutch Mantell, which is a guy still talking about it out on YouTube. The Mongolian Stomper, Bruiser Brody, Austin Idol, Rocky Johnson. Tommy Rich was a guy I remember from the magazines. Randy Savage, Rick Rude, and Bill Dundee. All names that I definitely remember from back in the day. So do you remember the big name guys flowing through occasionally, like a Flair or somebody?
Yeah, I remember them more flowing through Mid-South.
Yeah,
and
to be fair,
we had talked about the different guys through that and there's a laundry list of guys from Mid-South that went to both the Atlanta promotion and McMahon's promotion, and but I remember very clearly they would call it they bring a new star in and they would say it's his rookie season. Well, I remember when it was Ted DiBiase's rookie season, and he was getting in the Mid-South, and he was getting a big push. Well, Flair was the NWA champion, and DiBiase had been feuding with Dick Murdoch, and Murdoch had a deal at that time where he would get out in the ring and he'd have this big metal trash can with a board, 2x4 sticking out of it.
That's right.
And without fail, some idiot would come out there, would end up with the trash can on him, and him beating the crap out of the trash can.
I just saw that footage like 2 days ago.
Well, DiBiase had earned a championship match on TV with Flair.
Okay.
And it was going to be the last match, and I heard y'all talking about it.
Oh, yeah,
TV time remaining,
right,
and all that stuff. But he had been feuding with Dick Murdoch leading up to that. Mm-hmm. So halfway through the show, he gets the crap beaten out of him with a board by Dick Murdoch. He's got a big bloody head, and all that stuff. And but I'll never forget that because as a rookie, and he was the baby face, and everybody was rooting for him, and you wanted him to take that title from Flair, and just heartbroken when he lost his opportunity.
Murdoch thought he had lost the opportunity, even though DiBiase got the opportunity, and so they ended up quarreling. And there's footage of the other trick that Murdoch had with that trash can was he'd come out and bear hug it and collapse it.
Yes,
and he would challenge other guys to do that.
That's what it was,
and it always ended up with the other guy had it over his head, and he's beating it with a 2x4. Dick Murdoch and Killer Carl Cox both kind of leaned into that old Marine thing where they come out. This was before Sergeant Slaughter.
Yeah,
they would come out with Dick Murdoch had a knapsack with beer, a 6-pack of beer on the old plastic rings that would fall out, happen to fall out. And he had one of those shovels that folded too occasionally that he might need. But yes, the trash can, I just saw that footage 2 nights ago, and I was laughing about that.
And they were very similar in wrestling style. And if you remember, they had a tag. They were the Brain Busters.
Yeah, it was just brawling.
Yeah, it was just brawling.
For their purposes, they were just brawlers.
Yeah.
They leaned into that Cold War thing, as Ken and Casey and I talked about hard with the patriotic stuff, because if you think about it, whether they were legit foreigners or not, most of them were not, they had a whole stable of quote-unquote foreigners that they could float through and fight against these patriotic guys. Made for some great storylines.
Skandar Akbar and and all of those guys.
Kabuki with his dark arts and spitting the green crap everywhere.
Absolutely.
And the Mongolian Stomper and there was a Killer Khan or something like that was one of them. Of course, the Ugandan warrior.
Yeah, Kamala,
all those guys. Well, this says Terry Funk and Jerry Lawler in '81 had a massive feuds, and the Funks, I mean, they were Texas and all over the place.
I remember the Funk cycling through,
Yeah.
and there was a 2 or 3 month period where he and Lawler had a good rivalry and several memorable matches.
It's so funny
because they were always bloody. I mean, when Funk was involved, somebody was getting cut.
Yeah, and I always thought that the reputation that Bill Watts's program got was that it was so based on physicality.
Yeah.
You and I talked about earlier before we turned the mic on about how he got a lot of football players.
Yeah.
I always had that impression about Memphis because I was only catching Memphis through magazines. And it, like you said, Terry Funk was one of the worst. You'd look at pics from Lawler and Funk or whoever, and the dudes would just be battered all over the bloody. I always thought, well, man, if there's any outfit that's as rough and tumble as Mid-South with these big, it must be Memphis because they look like they were bloodying each other up every time they fought over there.
Yeah, there was a lot of cutting and stuff, but I don't remember them being really big guys. Lawler's not a big guy.
No, he's not. He's not very tall, is he?
No, and a lot of the guys that were really coming through at that point that were becoming the stars, like Rock and Roll Express and Midnight Express, they weren't big guys.
They weren't either. You're right.
And Bill Dundee, who was the champion there for a while, he wasn't a big guy.
Just saw his name. Yeah, I guess maybe Bill Watts had cornered the market on the old football player athletic types because I just saw Paul Orndorff's name pop up, and we know he had his run in several places in the South.
You mentioned Ken Patera earlier, and I remember when he first came to Mid-South, and he was the strong man.
He had the wrestling,
he had the
collegiate wrestling singlet. Yeah.
But he would do, like you were talking about, like Dick Murdoch and doing the crushing of the trash can. Well, he was always doing some feat of strength. And I remember distinctly one time they had him kind of between a car and like this concrete wall, and he's
outside the Mid-South Coliseum
pushing the car, holding the car off. And I'm thinking, and as a kid, you're thinking, damn, that guy's strong.
Well, and Iron Sheik.
And he was one of the first really muscled up guys.
He was legit. You remember Iron Sheik had the things he curled behind his head, the big clubs made out of wood or whatever. Feats of strength, now that I look back on it, was a thing for sure.
Yeah.
Because I want to say Butch Reed and somebody had like a bench press. Now, knowing what we know now, if some prop hits the ring, somebody's going to end up wearing it out of there, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
Dude's getting beat with all kinds of stuff.
But toward the end of Mid-South, you saw a lot of guys come through, like the Road Warriors. They came through and had a long run through there, and they were very fit. They took that physicality to another level there, and they were really some of the first guys wearing makeup and the paint and all that stuff, more costumed. And all that stuff, but they were a different level there.
Well, let me ask you this: did you? So what happened with us was, we only had Mid-South on the channel on the antenna, and then we got cable in '82, I think, somewhere in there. That was the first time we saw the Georgia outfit that Ted Turner. It's one time I think either owned it or it was certainly because of his station. And I joked about how low their ring was to the ground on our last podcast. But do you remember watching Bullet Bob Armstrong and his son Brad and Flair? That was NWA headquarters by then. And so it was Flair, it was Dusty Rhodes. You mentioned him earlier, Magnum TA. Do you remember watching that later in the afternoon, maybe 1 or 2 o'clock, coming on?
I kind of got cable about the same time you got cable. Okay. I was in college then, but that's when I really started watching some of that as well, because it would come on at like 5 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, or 5 or 6 or something like that on Saturday afternoon.
But yet another one to watch.
Yeah, something else to do. You get wrestling in the morning and wrestling at night. But there was a good, the Four Horsemen came through there, and with Flair and Tully Blanchard and the Andersons and all of those guys, and Magnum TA was a really rising star through that organization. But there was you remember Nikita Koloff?
Yes.
Well, supposedly his cousin Ivan Koloff.
Ivan Koloff, yeah.
But he was another Russian guy, was really muscled up, and he and
they all run together.
Yeah, they all run together. But
they probably had a cousin Boris.
They
somewhere.
probably did in another organization. But yeah, there was a good stable of guys through there, and you would start. That was at that time you were starting to really see guys abandoning one promotion and not just the trading, but truly abandoning one promotion and being gone and going to another.
Yeah, there was this other thing happening too that I bet some Memphis guys did that I'm seeing a lot more information about now. But Japan paid well apparently, and DiBiase was a huge star in Japan.
Flair was too.
Flair and these guys would disappear for 2 months over there and just go everywhere.
Yeah, and make a ton of money.
And the brilliant, and I keep saying this, and people are going to get sick of it, but the brilliant thing about the Bill Wattses of the business back then, and I'm sure Lawler you could say the same thing about, was that when they knew that was coming, I'm sure it was all contractually controlled stuff, but when you knew Flair was going to go away for a month, that gave you weeks to set up an angle where he's going to lose a loser leave town match, or JYD getting blinded by hair cream,
get injured and be gone for a while.
And so they built these like deadlines for things to happen for the fans.
Yeah.
And it's like my friend Ken said, he was like, if you missed anything, I don't remember reruns.
No, yeah.
If you missed a week, and I watched another broadcast the other night where they started the show with footage from like a Superdome event where a belt had changed hands.
Yep.
You don't want to come on Saturday and not know your guy didn't win. He got beat last week. So I mean, I just find the whole business back then fascinating, and I did do my research on Memphis enough to know that Lawler, he kind of took that over from Jeff Jarrett's dad, who was Jerry Jarrett, right?
Yep.
I think there were several Jarretts, actually, kids that wrestled. And so Lawler and him together kind of had a thing going, and then Lawler broke away towards Memphis, and Jarrett stayed up around Nashville, I think I read.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And the two didn't trade talent or anything. They kind of did their own.
Kind of more competitive.
And then Lawler ended up with all of it. He ended up with Nashville and Memphis at some point. So I told you earlier, I think it's interesting how the actual wrestling stars themselves ended up being owners, promoters, booking agents. Dusty Rhodes booked, Ernie Ladd booked, Lawler clearly, and then you had the creative roles where these guys made up these stories like Lawler and Kaufman, and honestly, I don't know who approached who about that deal. It'd be interesting.
It would be, to really know this.
I picture Lawler catching this act in some lounge in Memphis, drinking a beer and thinking this would be hysterical. Who knows? But I just wanted to talk to you about that because I know about Memphis because I know where you were growing up, and I didn't know what kind of access you had to it. Let's go back to Mid-South really quickly before I let you go on this one, and tell me who were your guys and who were your favorite guys and storylines from back there that you kind of remember, sort of have the most nostalgia for.
Yeah, I distinctly remember DiBiase's rookie year, and they pushed him hard for 2 or 3 years, and then he went to another promotion.
Right.
But they pushed him really hard for 2 or 3 years, and he was kind of my guy early on. I mean, there was a tag team that me and my nephew, who's 9 months younger than me, whenever we would wrestle with all of us, we were always the Masked Medics.
The Masked Medics.
And they
I don't know that name.
They were 2 guys, and they had white mask on, and they had an X on their forehead.
Goodness. I don't know them.
Yeah, so those were our guys, the Masked Medics.
That had to be out of the Tri-States days.
Yeah, probably.
That's something McGirt came up with. So when they went to Mid-South, you followed DiBiase on his comeback, being a good guy.
Yeah.
Well,
he was a good guy, early on. Yeah, when he left.
Came back, but then when the JYD stuff happened, he went heel for years. A really strong heel turn.
Heel for a long time.
And so you were still with it with the Stagger Lee and all that? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So he was one of the guys we followed with Masked Medics. I don't know if you remember this or not. Right at the end of the Mid-South run, before they folded, Sting and the Ultimate Warrior came through.
Yes.
And they were a tag team.
Yes.
They were called the Blade Runners.
Yes.
And
took me years of reminiscing back to realize that's who that actually was.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I remember watching them, and they were rough. I mean, they were early in their careers. But Sting obviously ended up in Atlanta and the Warrior in McMahon's organization.
You mentioned him earlier. I just want to ask you real quick what you remember about him, because he showed up in a lot of stuff, and I kind of just had brain lock about what happened with him. But they really pushed at some point through multiple outfits, Magnum TA.
Yeah.
What was the deal with him? Because I do remember him getting pushed. I want to say, I may be totally off base, but I want to say by the time Mid-South was losing DiBiase and JYD for good is when Magnum TA maybe slid in there.
Yeah,
but he had a run before that.
Yeah, he had
elsewhere, right?
Well, I remember him originating in Mid-South and then ultimately ending up in Ted Turner's organization.
Okay,
so he really got his big start in Mid-South, and he had some classic battles with Nikita Koloff and just classic, that they would show over and over again, and he got a really big push, and they were angling him to challenge Flair.
I was going to say to be the Flair from Mid-South.
Especially when and then after he went from Mid-South to NWA in Atlanta, they were really angling. I mean, when he got there, he tag teamed with Dusty Rhodes quite a bit. And just as he was getting ready to get his big push, he had a car accident and basically lost use of one of his arms.
Is that right?
Yeah,
because he was a big, muscular dude, too.
Yeah.
He had the blonde hair and the mustache. I think they probably ripped that Magnum PI thing off for sure.
Absolutely.
So that's what it was. Okay, because I knew they had clearly propped him up to be a
he was teed up
presence.
Yeah, he was teed up for a huge run and had that car accident.
Wow.
And ended his career.
I did not know that. I had no idea. All right, final question about wrestling, because I always have to ask this, because one of the things also that got me down this road for the podcast was that movie came out about the Von Erichs. What do you remember about the Texas wrestling and the Von Erich family in general from back in those? Because they definitely got loaned out around the country occasionally. And Mid-South was they definitely had Kerry Von Erich at house shows at Mid-South. They showed footage of big events in the Superdome where they borrowed him from Fritz for a week or whatever. What do you remember about that? Because I think with all that happened to them, ultimately, it's quite an interesting story, and everybody kind of has their own little relationship with how that went.
A tragic story for their family, obviously.
Right.
But to be honest with you, I don't remember them that much. I remember Kerry coming through a little bit, and I remember his time in the WWF. But he was clearly a shadow of himself at that point. But the Texas promotion, I really didn't have much exposure to.
That's
you were a lot closer to it than I was, and you could probably see it. And they probably did trade more with the Shreveport area than they were doing with Mid-South.
My understanding is that Bill Watts, even though he didn't have Texas, he did have Houston.
Mm-hmm.
That was all he had, unless it was way out west. And so Watts was big on Superdome shows. They draw 30,000 to New Orleans Superdome. But from what I understand is that he worked with Fritz just like he did Lawler and these other guys on borrowing talent. And so I didn't know where you were and the way TV worked back then, if that had made the impression on you. Because let me tell you, all of us, we could not wait to hear if Kerry Von Erich was going to do a guest spot on Mid-South or something, because we were so enamored with him being I think he was the national shot put or discus champion and he was supposed to go to the Olympics according to that movie.
Yeah.
And then they boycotted it in 80?
Yeah.
And so he didn't get to go. So there was just a whole lot to that, and obviously appeal to young people. I just didn't know if you had as much exposure to it as we did. But, so I did not know before we had this discussion that you had actually seen the Andy Kaufman thing in the flesh. You told me you'd seen it. I thought you meant you watched it just like you were there.
I was there.
Brainbuster night.
Yeah.
That may be my proudest fact I know about you.
I'm going to add that to my resume.
That may be the best thing I know about you. It's certainly not that Raiders fan thing for sure. All right. Anything else about wrestling and the good old days?
Man, I could talk wrestling all day.
I do want to ask one more, and I'll shut up. Have you been to any matches? You have a son. Did you ever take Josh?
Oh yeah,
locally?
absolutely.
Okay, what have you been to?
Yeah, so we, we became WCW fans.
Okay.
When that promotion was really going on, and we went to a lot of house shows in Little Rock, and really close to the ring. And and Josh got to touch Goldberg one night. When Goldberg's big run, and so I raised Josh right. He still watches wrestling. He's almost 40 years old, but he still gets all the WWF pay-per-views.
I told them I took the kids to one in Little Rock, and I was so impressed. Of course, it was on TV, but I was so impressed with how they time out their matches.
Yeah.
It's like clockwork.
Yeah.
Like they know how to end a match in exactly 1 minute. If someone whispers to them that it's got to end in a minute, they know exactly how to do it. And then they sprint out of there and start. And I thought that was fascinating when you think back to what we saw, which it looked like it took careful editing just to pull off the hour-long program on Saturdays because it looked so chaotic. And by the way, Jimmy Cornette says it was that chaotic. He can tell you about filming all day. They call them promotions on Wednesdays or something in Shreveport. They go
one after another.
They go to the TV station and they'd have to cover every storyline for every part of the area. And he's like, it was actually hard to keep that straight sometimes. Like, who's going to have the belt by Saturday? They had to think through it all and do it. But it was not the well-oiled machine that WCW and WWE ended up being for sure. I figured you and Josh had gone to some live events.
We proudly have a picture that goes through our digital frame of me and Josh standing in the crowd at a WWF event in Little Rock, and Josh is holding up a sign that says "Woo" on it, and we were on the broadcast, it was a snap out of the broadcast.
Man, I didn't know that either. That's really cool. All right, dude. If you don't have anything else about wrestling, I think we have done a good job. We got 40 minutes out of Memphis and Mid-South, so I'm happy.
It was a lot of fun.
I learned a lot about you, man. the Andy Kaufman thing, I'm gonna have to think on that a while because that was such a weird little pulse.
But it was such a cultural, happening as well.
I just saw a YouTube thing popped up about it just a few days ago. Of course, YouTube knows I'm looking at wrestling now. So and it just popped up about. I think he threw his coffee or water in Lawler's face. And so anyway, knowing that you were actually there for the Brain Buster is really, really cool. All right, man. I appreciate it, Steve. Thank you so much, man.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.